Mayana Nafi, and this isn't exactly in the order. Oh, it is sort of in order. Mayana Nafi is a transgender autistic person who works as a policy counsel at the National Center for Transgender Equality. As part of the NCT team, Mayan advocates to end discrimination and violence against transgender people, including by fighting anti-trans state legislation and expanding meaningful access to healthcare and education. Mayan graduated from Harvard Law School before joining NCT this last year as a law fellow, and a very good friend of mine, as well as the poor victim who volunteers to cat sit my cat whenever I am out of town. Finn Gardner is an incoming Masters of Public Policy student at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis. He is the Boston Community Coordinator for the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, where he builds liaisons with local nonprofits and government agencies to advance disability rights, and mobilizes disability activists to engage in intersectional community advocacy. I have known Finn for way longer than I care to admit, and well before any of us even thought that we would ever be in DC. So, welcome here. Siraj Jarrell Johnson, am I pronouncing that right?
Yes.
Okay.
For perhaps the first
Awesome.
time. Yes.
Is a Black non-binary writer and librarian currently living in Philadelphia. Their work as a librarian is focused on providing digital literacy and training to older adults in order to bridge the digital divide. Their writing explores disability as a cyborg identity, the uses of animality, and millennial Afro-pessimism. They will begin a Master's of Fine Arts and Poetry at Columbia University this fall. I hope you enjoy New York, for how much it can stink at times. Greta Martella is the co-founder and executive director of the Trans Lifeline and overall awesome. Ms. Martella has drawn on her own experience with suicidality to create a resource that is able to respond to the needs of the trans community. Ms. Martella also serves on the Consumer and Survivor Committee of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Prior to founding the Trans Lifeline, Ms. Martella worked as a software engineer. And Sonia Renee Taylor is the founder and radical executive officer. I like that job title, actually. It must look really good on business cards. Of The Body Is Not an Apology, an international movement, digital media, and education company committed to radical self-love and body empowerment as the foundational tool for social justice and global transformation. The Body Is Not an Apology reaches over 250,000 people weekly in 140 countries with their content and educational projects. Sonia's work as an award-winning performance poet, activist, speaker, and transformational leader continues to have global reach. She has appeared across the US, New Zealand, Australia, England, Scotland, Sweden, Germany, Canada, and the Netherlands. Sonia and her work has been seen, heard, and read on HBO, BED, MTV, TV One, NPR, PBS, CNN, Oxygen Network, The New York Times, New York Magazine, MSNBC.com, Today.com, Huffington Post, Vogue Australia, Shape.com, Miss Magazine, and many more. She has shared stages with such luminaries such as Carrie Mae Weems, Thester Gates, Harry Belafonte, Dr. Cornel West, Hillary Rodham Clinton, Delayed Amiri Baraka, and numerous others. Sonia continues to perform, speak, and facilitate workshops globally. So, round of applause for our panel before we begin. And I guess since that's the order in which we are all sitting, we might as well start with remarks by Siraj.
Do I push this guy?
Yeah.
Okay, I was afraid I was going to have to go first. My opening remarks are called The Queer and Trans Cripple and the Straight Cis Able-Bodied Care Mountain, because that's what my life is. So for a disabled person with a life-altering sickness unto death, as I have, contact with the healthcare system is often compulsory. To opt out comes with big financial repercussions and could cost you your life. Yet these forced interactions are never only about disability. When my doctor looks at me, she sees my race, class, gender, size, and sexuality too, among other things. Some of these factors are helpful. While I was raised poor and working class, I now work a professional job. I am not fat. I do not use a wheelchair. All of these things allow me to be seen as more important, more credible, and more worthy of life than those who experience those marginalizations. Most of them, though, complicate my care. They conspire to make me easier to kill. As a Black, non-binary trans person who is bisexual and has multiple disabilities, my health and wellness is not always a priority to my doctor. This is a crisis exactly because there is a great danger for multiply marginalized people at our intersections. Like many people with systemic lupus erythematosus, I knew I had lupus many years before any doctor got it together to tell me so. As a poor, Black, uninsured, queer teenager who was out to everybody, my suffering was not important. I would have painful lupus flares and my friends would rush me to the emergency room. The doctors never really looked that hard, so they never found anything wrong. But the pain continued, and I lost my hair, and I lost the ability to walk without a cane or a limp, and I was always tired, but unfortunately, I was not someone who mattered. After 6 years of asking, I finally got a diagnosis. And that's important because I was in college in Massachusetts, and most importantly, I finally had insurance for the first time. Insurance, like many people are experiencing for the first time through the Affordable Care Act, helped me greatly. It is the reason that I am not dead. Many parts of the act, particularly the part about guaranteed issue, mean that there is less discrimination against disabled people in the insurance pool. More people than ever are insured, but that does not mean that doctors or healthcare systems have demystified their processes, and it doesn't mean that anyone has to treat disabled people who have more contact with the medical industrial complex than anyone else with respect. Although I have been covered by my employer's health insurance program for 2.5 years, I spent the better part of last year unable to access any care. The gender on my insurance was deemed inaccurate, and no doctor would see me, including my rheumatologist. Worse still, I could not change it myself because my insurance company would not allow me to do so. I am still paying bills from that period, even for things that should have been covered. These gatekeepers prevent the lofty dream of near universal health insurance from being realized. There must be trainings for doctors, hospital staff, and insurance companies, with sanctions for noncompliance. Their mistake could cost me my life. What does it cost them? When people are denied access to healthcare because of their gender identity or perceived gender identity, sexuality or perceived sexuality, it is an act of violence that sits beside the violence disabled, queer, and trans people experience every day. We now know that 40% of Black folks killed by the cops are disabled. What we don't currently know is how many queer and trans folks are killed through denial of care, through neglect of callous doctors, through fear of going to the doctor, through preventable disease. This is yet another war on our communities and is allowed to continue silently and unquestioned. We need an increase in government-sponsored health and wellness programs just for queer and trans people. Anti-smoking, care for people living with addiction, one of the most stigmatized groups of people with disabilities. We need universal health care for trans elders. We need places for trans elders to live. This too is healthcare. How can a community continue without protecting those among us with the knowledge and the wisdom to help us keep fighting, whose struggles have paved our way for our wins today? Every day, I see my people fall off the sides of the straight, cis, able-bodied care mountain. We are run through by falling rocks and icicles. We are unable to navigate to the top because our paths have been intentionally blocked. Only policymakers are powerful enough, have access to enough resources to remove the debris that blocks our way to care, and it is high time that we got to business.
With that, I will pass on the table and the floor to Finn.
Thank you. So I'm glad to be here in front of all of you. There is a severe lack of recognition of intersectionality in the disability community, well, in the mainstream disability community in some places. Obviously not here, but it is a constant and systemic problem that needs to be addressed. People have this idea that disability is something that is experienced by itself, that it is completely atomized from other issues, that when you have a disability, that is your only marginalization, that is the only thing that you encounter that makes things more difficult for you, that may threaten your life, that may make it more difficult for you to get a job, or get married, or go to school, or be treated as an equal part of your community. That's definitely not the case. I, for one, am a Black, queer, trans, fat, autistic, disabled person who grew up working class and lower middle class, who has experienced all kinds of intersections. And to define my experiences as just being my disability completely erases the other things that I have encountered. I've dealt with racism. I've gone to schools where people have sat there calling me racist slurs in a classroom for kids with disabilities. There was a kid that would sit there calling me the N-word. So while I was having my disability accommodated, I was still dealing with racism. I've had unstable housing. I've been homeless. I would be in a shelter for youth that was supposed to be there to help me. But instead, I would be discriminated against for being trans. I would be harassed by cisgender Black gay people. So on the one hand, you'd think I'd be able to fit in because of my race and because I was queer, but because I was trans, I was being treated as an outcast. And this was in San Francisco, surprisingly enough. You'd think they'd be better, but no. I've had problems fitting in places where you'd think I would fit in because I'm autistic, because the way I present socially doesn't always represent what people in other communities may expect. People may want, for example, a lot of us Black folks, there's this idea that we have to be very outgoing, we have to be very open in ways that are very difficult for me, and that makes it hard. And so these intersections often make it more difficult for me and others in situations like me to feel like we're fully part of the community. And as advocates, as policymakers, as allies, as other members of the communities that I and other people like me belong to, we need to recognize that you can't dismiss people. You can't create the situation where people feel like outcasts just because of who they are and because they experience more than one thing at a specific time. We need to listen. We need to pay attention to the experiences of those of us who have multiply marginalized identities. And that listening can take several different forms. You can go online and read our accounts and on blogs and Facebook pages and Twitter. You can talk to us in person, read books, support us. Make sure that our voices are being heard, because you can't have disability justice without intersectionality. To paraphrase a great feminist writer who said, "My feminism will be intersectional or it will be," pardon my language, bullshit. Our disability activism has to be intersectional or it will be bullshit. It will not work otherwise. It can't be about, oh, you have a disability, that's it. That's not the case. That is not my life. That is not the lives of these other people on this panel. That is not the lives of many of the other people in this audience. You can't just say, this is how it is. I am a queer disabled person, and that has affected my life. That has determined the course of my life, and that has led me to fight for the things that I fight for. The reason why I'm going into public policy is that I want to change things. I want to make it better. And if I'm going to be influencing policymakers and maybe become a policymaker myself, I want to do that, because there is no way that we're ever going to achieve justice without recognizing these intersections that interlock, that are intertwined in our lives, that are written all over our bodies, our souls, our minds, our lives' experiences.
Thank you. And I would pass it to Greta Gustava Martella. Before I do that, I would encourage all of you in this panel to, once you're done talking, when you're not talking, turn off the microphone, since hanging out near a hot mic is a bit of an extreme sport. So, yeah.
Hello, I'm Greta Gustava Martella, like Victoria said. I spend most of my time working on suicide in the trans community. What's interesting about suicide is it's something that happens in isolation, and so it allows me to see all the different ways in which we become isolated in our society. Particularly with trans people, becoming isolated is something that not so much that trans people are choosing to do, but it's a result of oppression upon oppression upon oppression. Many trans people get to a state where they are afraid to leave their house, where they get anxiety attacks being in a situation with a new person that they don't know is safe. Many trans people only feel safe in the company of other trans people. I think that one of the things that we're not talking about is how these, kind of very real oppressions are creating disability in the trans community, how we're creating trans people who are unable to function by the way that we're treating them in society. Trans people are like any other people in that we want jobs, we would love to have these mundane lives that other people take for granted, but being denied basic personhood in multiple settings is something that I don't think anyone can survive unscathed. I think having your personhood denied is a wound that is difficult to heal from for anyone. Trans Lifeline is largely staffed by volunteers. We have a few permanent staff. Overwhelmingly, the people who are answering the phone for other trans people are disabled trans people who have time to dedicate to peer support for other people. Because our resource is by and for the community, there's not a sharp line between the people calling the line and the people staffing the line. And so it's become a group of people who are supporting each other in a very organic way. I think there are a lot of questions about, there's a stigma, there's a stereotype of the crazy trans woman that is often used to silence the anger of trans women at the oppression that they face. But I think it's also accurate in that trans folks are suffering mental illnesses that are the direct results of the ways in which we are oppressed in our society. We're getting ready to do a survey with the LGBTQ task force to look into, that was announced earlier by Victoria, to look into what is happening to trans people when they try to access mental health care. The reason this is so pressing for us is that if you are anyone else and you call a suicide hotline, if you are not trans, if you are anyone else, the normal procedure is if somebody believes that you're about to make an attempt on your life would be to call 911. For our community, that's an unacceptable procedure. Trans people are frequently hospitalized and then can't get back out of the psychiatric hospital because somebody has an axe to grind about their gender. We are losing trans people who are trying to check themselves into psychiatric hospitals because somebody's got an axe to grind about trans identities and whether they're legitimate. So we're really looking forward to getting this survey out there, and I'm hoping that you all support us in getting this survey out to folks. We want to find out things like what percentage of the trans community have a disability. What kinds of experiences are they having in a psychiatric hospital? What kind of difficulties are they having accessing psychiatric care? I don't think we really know as a society how well trans people can thrive, because things that other people take for granted, trans people can't access without having their very existence invalidated. So thank you, everybody, for being here today. It's such a beautiful crowd. Thank you.
Sonia? Yes, definitely, I should get my eyesight checked again. I just got the text message saying, it's been a year, you should come back, and I ignored it. So, Sonia?
Good morning, good afternoon. I'm not sure what time it is, but I'm certainly deeply grateful to be here in the presence of such brilliance on the panel and such power in the audience. My name is Sonia Renee Taylor. I'm the founder and radical executive officer of The Body Is Not an Apology. The Body Is Not an Apology is really designed to be a digital platform that creates the opportunity for people who live at the intersection of identities to tell their stories, to not have their stories told by other people, and for those stories to have the same sort of space and bandwidth in the digital realm that larger platforms get every single day, that HuffPo gets, that name them, whatever they are, Jezebel, what all of those other online digital mediums that are often written as a sort of a quota basis. When we see the stories of LGBT or disabled people in those places, it's like, oh, we need to do that this month, let's throw that out there, right? And the goal of The Body Is Not an Apology is to create a place where those stories are centered, and where the people that are telling those stories live those stories, and where those stories not only are about telling the story, but about creating access for people with greater privilege to understand. We believe that so much of the oppression that we see in the world is a function of our inability to make peace with the body, our own bodies and the bodies of others, no matter how those bodies show up on the planet. And so much of the content that we create is about drawing the lines between the individual experience and the larger structural and systemic issues that are reinforcing those individual experiences. One of the things that is very important to me as a fat, Black, queer, neurodivergent woman, when I started The Body Is Not an Apology, the perception was it was mostly about this sort of burgeoning idea of body positivity and the way in which that narrative became so quickly co-opted to mean white, cis, able-bodied women being allowed to feel okay in a size 12. And it became very clear to me that there was a conversation that we were missing that was, what does it mean to be body positive in a disabled body? What does it mean to be body positive in a Black or a Latinx or an Arab body? What does it mean to be body positive in a queer body, a trans body, a body with mental health issues? What do all of those things mean, and how do we access that? And what I found was that there was a lack of space in the digital realm where people were processing that conversation in that way. And that body positivity unto itself as this notion of how do I individually feel better does nothing to dismantle the systems of oppression that exist in our society. And so if we can't figure out how to be body positive and then make a world that then honors those bodies we feel positive about, we haven't done anything, right? So The Body Is Not an Apology really came from that, and our education programming came from that. One of the things that we're also very clear about is that we have seen throughout history systems and structures change 1,000 times. And all of the time, those systems, structures change and then morph to accommodate oppression and marginalization again. And the reason that we believe those systems and structures change and then morph to accommodate marginalization and oppression again is because what we haven't done is we actually haven't changed hearts and minds. And you can change all the structures in the world, and if the people who create those structures continue to hold animus and bias and oppression and prejudice inside of them, they will recreate those systems whether they mean to or not. And if they hold them about themselves, it is undoubtedly that they will hold them about others. And so our work is really about creating how we dismantle that inside of ourselves, that we create the access to dismantle it in the world. One of the things that I keep hearing on the panel that I think for me is one of the most important framings that we do with The Body Is Not an Apology is that we talk about marginalization and oppression as a very specific thing. We call it body terrorism. And we call it body terrorism intentionally, because the reality is to wake up every day wondering whether or not if I call a suicide hotline, the police are going to come and kill me is an act of terrorism on someone's body. To go to a hospital and not be certain if you are going to get the care that you need for your autoimmune disease because your physician has bias as to whether or not you're fat or you're a person of color or you're trans is a terroristic society to live into. And so if we, as I sit in a White House forum today, put the amount of energy and resource that we put into fighting international terrorism, whatever that means, into fighting the systems and structures in this country that reinforce lives of terror on bodies that are disabled, bodies that are queer, and bodies that live at the margins, we would have a different world immediately. And so I hope that The Body Is Not an Apology can continue to be a platform that raises that issue with the multitude of voices that are in this space and out in the world. Thank you.
Mayan?
Thanks. I'm Mayan. I work at the National Center for Transgender Equality. It is a huge honor to be sharing this space with all of these incredible co-panelists and with all of you as well. I joined the National Center for Transgender Equality a few months ago, and just in the time that I've been here, we have seen this explosion of visibility for trans people, and then with that, this enormous amount of backlash. So in schools, in the media, at home, we're hearing, trans people are hearing, that our identities are an illusion, that our very presence is threatening or traumatizing or dangerous for other people, that we should be excluded from public spaces, and that our lives are not as valuable as others. Speaking for someone who works in the trans advocacy movement, I think that a lot of times we don't talk enough, as some of my co-panelists have mentioned, we don't talk enough about how this kind of rhetoric and this kind of discrimination has a different impact on trans people of color, on trans disabled people, on other people who are already under attack because of other aspects of who they are. Against people who are already being told that their existence is threatening or wrong, people who are already being denied an equal right to move through public spaces, to go to work, to go to school, people who are already being treated like they're expendable. And I think that spaces like these are just so important because they allow us to have these conversations and allow us to recognize what we as queer and trans disabled people are already doing and what we can do more to assert our right to exist. In the trans autistic community, and there is an enormous trans autistic community, these conversations have already been happening for a long time and have been led and shaped by an incredible number of trans autistic people, several of whom are in this room. But often we're not being heard by the broader LGBT movement or the broader trans movement, and also we're not being heard often by the broader disability movement. And we need to talk about these issues as a larger community. We need to talk about the ways, for example, that myths about autistic people's abilities and identities and skepticism about trans people's genders are routinely used against trans autistic people who are so often told that we can't understand our gender, we cannot make decisions about our bodies because we're autistic. We need to talk about the ways that trans autistic people are denied basic autonomy, often by family members, often by medical professionals, to make decisions about how we look or express our gender or about what kind of care we want or we don't want. We need to talk about the ways that trans and gender nonconforming people, trans and gender nonconforming autistic people rather, especially trans autistic people of color, are doubly or triply sometimes impacted by this epidemic of police brutality, mass incarceration, and the school to prison pipeline. And we need to talk about what it means to be autistic and trans in a world where both trans and disabled people are facing horrific levels of violence and abuse in and out of the home, often by the people that we're supposed to be able to trust the most. I'm proud of the work that the trans autistic community, that other queer and trans disability communities have been doing to fight these injustices. And I'm so glad we're all here to elevate that work and take it to the next level.
Before I open it to questions from the audience, I want to ask a very easy question. Just kidding. I would never ask an easy question here. What does intersectionality mean to all of you?
Okay. I think that intersectionality is sometimes difficult because I don't know that people are currently allowed to live at all their intersections. I think that sometimes people look at you like you're trying to collect them all, like you got to catch all the problems. I'm someone who lives with systemic lupus erythematosus, but I'm also a person on the autistic spectrum. And one of the things that I experience really frequently is just as a non-binary autistic person, you're doing gender wrong. Like you're just not doing it right. Like I don't know why you can't just be a binary person or be a cis person. And I think that that's partially about how I perceive my body as an autistic spectrum person, right? Like I was a person who lived a gender nonconforming childhood because I was diagnosed with Asperger's when I was 3 years old. So I think that that's one place where intersectionality doesn't really exist. I'm also a former chapter lead for Black Lives Matter Philadelphia. So another place where intersectionality might not really exist is thinking about the overwhelming amount of autistic people who are killed by the cops every year. When we say that disabled people are being killed by the cops, disabled Black people, we predominantly mean Black autistic people. And in addition to that, Black people with mental illness that are living, that are homeless. And so as we just saw, 40% of homeless youth, what are they? They're LGBT, right? So that's an intersection that nobody actually cares about because it's the most expendable parts of our community who are being murdered. I think that intersectionality is a really cool buzzword, but it's not actually something that we always live in any community that's marginalized. I don't know that we're really equipped yet.
Thank you. As a response to one of your comments, it's okay for identities to end up being like Pokemon, of having a very large collection. This is speaking as someone who was a kid during the Pokemon age, during the craze. And indeed, many identities are often, even the people with the most marginalized identities, even then they are afraid to come out about many others.
Okay. I think that I have an ideal of intersectionality, and there's also the reality of how it presents itself, which Saray mentioned so wonderfully earlier. So ideally, intersectionality is the recognition of our lived experiences as things that interlocked that can affect and flow into each other. As I mentioned before, I'm a queer, Black, disabled, autistic, Black person, and that is something that, it colors my daily life. None of these things is separate. They all affect the way I live and the way people treat me. But they don't, in reality, when I'm interacting with people, they may only see one thing. They may not see it as intersectional. But philosophically, intersectionality is, as I said, the recognition that those issues do intersect, that they don't exist in a vacuum. And that philosophy of intersectionality is something, that things can't be separated like that. It's something that I bring to my work with the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, managing the Boston chapter and sort of building capacity, that I really work very hard to infuse intersectionality in everything we do. There is absolutely no tolerance for treating autism as though it is solely the preserve of white dudes, young white dudes. That's not what I want in our chapter. That's not the way I want autistic advocacy to look like. Because we, autistic people, belong to all communities, all racial backgrounds, all gender backgrounds, all classes, nationalities, other disabilities. We're everywhere. And if we're going to be effective advocates for autistic folks and other people with disabilities, that's what we've got to do. And that's the philosophy behind my idea of intersectionality.
It's hard to follow some of those comments on intersectionality and feel like I have a lot to add about it. I would say one of the things that has been interesting about a lot of trans people are possessing multiple intersecting marginalized identities. And, one of the things that occurs to us, we train our operators on the line not to ask people about their gender, that this is the one place where they don't have to negotiate their trans identity to get to some of the other stuff that they might want to talk about. And it strikes me that, in some ways, the privilege of not having intersectional identities is that you can view these things one-dimensionally, that you don't have to go into these multiple dimensions of identity to understand the oppressions that you're facing, the difficulties you might be facing in your life. And so I guess another interesting thing about Trans Lifeline is it's a large group of people. We've trained over 500 people, and largely I've never seen any of these people, but I've interacted with them a lot. And so in a lot of ways, we don't know people's intersecting identities at Trans Lifeline. And it's been interesting, as you get to know people, to start to know them more fully, to realize that in some ways it can be a relief not to have to negotiate every piece of your identity, to just talk about that one thing that's actually the thing that's important to you at that moment. Clearly we work very hard to make sure that nobody's left behind at Trans Lifeline, that we are an accepting space for everyone. And I think that's probably all the talk we need by the white person on the panel about intersectionality. So I'm going to pass that along. But I think the privilege to not talk about, privilege is to be able to have your problems in one dimension rather than having these multiple dimensions of your problems.
I think that, I'm not going to say anything that I think is all that different than what's been said. What I am present to are the times at which those intersections become weighted in different ways. I was just on my Facebook timeline, the unhappiness that is your Facebook memories. I don't know who thought this was a good idea. I'm like, thanks for that thing I didn't need to remember. But it was reminding me of last year's SCOTUS decision on marriage equality, while at the same time reminding me of SCOTUS's decision on the Voting Act rights, right? And I was like, oh, the queer girl really wants to celebrate, and the black girl really wants to vote. And these don't live in the same place right now. And so, there are these moments when my intersecting identities in this system of oppression, in this system of body terrorism, are in competition inside of me. And I think that we don't create the space to talk about how not only does intersectionality need to exist in the ways in which we frame the world, but in the ways in which our lived experiences are always at challenge because we've created a society that has made us at war with ourselves. And that to me is just such a salient piece. And then there was one last thing that I wanted to say. Yes, that. Part of the reason I think we would be so much further in the world just in addressing all of the issues of marginalization and oppression if we attacked each problem that showed up from an intersectional lens. My brain is always saying, if we could figure out how to make sure that the queer, Black, Latinx, trans, undocumented youth got access to that, we can make sure everybody could. And so what would it look like to be asking those questions on a regular basis from a lens that includes all of the ways in which people show up on the planet?
So I'm going to second a lot of what's been said on the panel. I'm personally a little suspicious, a little wary of using the term intersectionality, just because a lot of times in practice, what it means is like, here comes your LGBT status and here comes your disability, and they just kind of intersect, and we're just going to talk about your identity as if it's sort of you just sort of add one and add the other, and this is what your experience is like. And in reality, that's not like that at all. I think we need to recognize that that people with multiply oppressed identities often have a very fundamentally different experience. So as a trans, non-binary, autistic person, when I'm listening to other trans people, to non-autistic trans people talk about what being trans is like for them, or what the trans experience is like, or the kinds of discrimination that they face, a lot of that's just doesn't sound like my experience. It often feels like being trans and being autistic is just a fundamentally different experience than just being trans. I think we really need to change the way we think about intersectionality to make spaces for that, to not just say, we're going to talk about we're not going to talk about discrimination against trans people, and then, by the way, here's a bit of disability stuff to add into it. We need to think about creating spaces that address the many different types of trans experiences, the many different types of queer experiences, the many types of experiences of disability.
Awesome. Yes, opening to questions. Lydia.
Hi, I'm Lydia Brown, and I love everything that all of you have said. I am so excited about the awesome, fabulous power that is in this room right now. But I want to pose a question to each of you as activists, as organizers, as scholars, as leaders in our multiple communities. How can we get over we're talking about, what about the people who live at the most impacted sets of oppression? And we have this habit in movements of, as someone, I don't remember who it was writing about this, leading with our oppressed identities, which is so important when we're constantly erased. When I'm erased as being both a trans and autistic person and a person of color, but specifically an East Asian person of color. We lead with our oppressed identities, but we're forgetting the enormous amount of privilege that every one of us in this room is in the White House right now. That is an enormous amount of privilege. Even those of us who are in this room who are more impacted than others in this room in different ways still attained some amount of social capital and privilege to be here. We're able to communicate using verbal speech, at least temporarily, for purposes of being in this room. And that means that we're by and large talking about folks that sometimes share identities with us, many identities or experiences, but might not. Some folks in here may have been formerly homeless, currently homeless, intermittently, precariously housed, formerly incarcerated, currently undocumented. Actually, I don't know if undocumented people are able to get past the waives form, not information I have. But regardless of the other experiences that we each have, we're not acknowledging in the movements that we create, in the communities that we create, even if an organization is led entirely by QTPOC, an organization is led entirely by disabled people of color, who had the social capital and the privilege to make it to that space? Who has the social capital to throw around words like intersectionality or being trans? Like, who are the people who don't have the words to describe their experience, but they know who they are? Like, what are we able to do to leverage both our experiences as, in many cases, multiply oppressed people, but also people who have education privilege, whether or not we got the college degree, but those of us who have linguistic privilege, because we're able to communicate with each other right now, who have some amount of minimal respectability privilege that we're in this room, to actually bring in the people who don't have those privileges so that they're in this conversation, not me, not the person who's currently working toward a graduate degree like a couple of you are, not the person who has been able to speak at multiple events like most of us have that are in here right now. Like, what do we do for the friend of mine who is a trans woman? She's autistic. She is non-speaking by and large. When she does speak, she doesn't speak in a way that most people understand her verbal communication. She's under guardianship, she's in a group home, and she's literally prevented from even going to an LGBTQ event because her legal guardians are anti-queer and anti-trans. So never even mind access to gender-affirming care, never even mind access to legal name changing or changing the gender marker on her identification documents. She can't even meet up with other LGBTQ people without like the one staff person who is sympathetic to this situation sneaking her out of the group home to go to an LGBTQ space. What about the other friend of mine who is a trans person of color, multiply disabled and chronically ill, who's homeless? What can we do to leverage our privilege to address the issues affecting not us, and to acknowledge our privilege in these conversations, not just our oppressions?
Okay, who wants to take Lydia's question?
I'm happy to talk about this. I think, I think about this a lot because we are hearing from people on the line. We get people calling us on the line, actually specifically like your friend's situation, who's people who are unable to transition because their guardians are transphobic, or, these are problems, like when I hear what the problems they're having are, like, I don't even know how to begin to solve that problem. But I think this is why there's an importance in kind of peer-to-peer, community-led efforts to fix these problems. I think the more that we can involve as many people in the community as possible in the solutions to our problems, these solutions start to look more like our communities and less like something that's kind of a top-down approach. I would love to take credit for the things that we've done right at Trans Lifeline, but all along the way, we've had community members who are volunteers who are engaging online or on the phone with us, tell us what we're doing wrong. And, and I do also think that, part of the reason I'm here is that when I did transition, I acknowledged my own privilege. I was sharply aware of how privileged I was compared to other trans women. I was a software engineer in San Francisco. I had this big salary, I had access to health care, and I felt a responsibility that I have to do something with all this privilege, not just go home and watch Netflix. And so I think that we need to view folks in the community who have resources. I think they owe something to the community to contribute those resources back to the community, to try to, lift everyone up. And, it can be, I don't think it's helpful to anyone to just sit at home and feel guilty about the level of privilege that you have. I think it's helpful to join a board or to donate or whatever privilege you have to find a way to leverage it to lift everybody up. That's my way of thinking about how we get there. But the community is definitely where everything has to come from. We have to disabuse ourselves of these top-down notions that we're going to have these leaders who are going to tell us how to fix everything. The solutions have to come from the community, and we have to be listening to the community, and we have to involve the community, and we need grassroots efforts, not just policy efforts.
I'd like to add something as well, just very briefly. Well, as much brevity as I could do. So I definitely think that it is absolutely crucial to include people who struggle with their intersections more so than the people on this panel do. There are different ways that we can do that. For example, we can engage in education of people, service providers who work with people who are more systemically marginalized. For example, educating people who work with, homeless services, people who work in clinics that are often used by people who use Medicaid vouchers. We can talk to people who may, like lawyers who serve as legal guardians for people with disabilities, foster homes, those kinds of things. There are definitely concrete ways that we can achieve that kind of inclusion, or at least make steps in that direction.
Very briefly, like I said, I'm a person with systemic lupus erythematosus. Most of the people who die from systemic lupus erythematosus are Black women, right? So it is the kind of disease that's definitely impacting the Black community in a really disproportionate way, and also other communities of color. And I think that to what the person in the green tunic said, we have to agitate. There's no way around it. It's great to be at the White House. I literally never thought in my life, but here I am. And the only thing that I can really take away from it is we do have to agitate. I work at the only lending library in America, specifically devoted to HIV and AIDS, called the AIDS Library in Philadelphia. And one thing I know is that every single chronically ill person owes an incredible debt to the AIDS activists of the 80s and 90s. There's no question that without that organizing and agitating, without the die-ins, that we would not be here today to have this conversation. And it's time. It's high time. I mean, the price of the lupus medication, there are no medications for lupus. We use other people's medications, increased so drastically. We don't even think of that as how many people died from that, right? Like how many people are no longer here just because you increased the medication, you had no way to regulate it, right? It's great to talk to folks who already know, but it's better to come to their door and tell them what's up.
Just to add really quickly that I think part of the way that we get to what it is you're talking about is that we also can't be in these spaces without a class analysis. We can't be in these spaces without thinking about the ways in which our economic systems further the oppressions of bodies, right? And so one of the things that I am try to be really committed to is that when I'm speaking on a panel, I ask myself, am I the right person to be speaking on this panel? And the truth was I questioned that even in the request to be here today. But because I believe that the body is not an apology, represents something that's so much bigger than me, I felt like sure. But regularly, when in a position of privilege, I ask myself, am I the right person? And who is the person who wouldn't get this opportunity, who should be up here? And then I relinquish the opportunity to that person. And I think the more that we do that, the more that we'll see those voices also being in these spaces. Because part of it is it's got to be a bit of a bait and switch, right? The system doesn't want those people at the table. So us with access need to hold the door open and say, come on in. And I think the more that we do that, the more we'll begin to see how those things change.
Hi, my name's Andy. I recently moved here for a federal position as a policy advisor, and I identify as a gay Latino male that grew up in foster care and made it all the way to DC. So, wow. And I do recognize that I'm really privileged because I, like one of the panelists said, and several people in the room said, I never thought I'd be sitting in the White House for any reason whatsoever. And I never thought I would see LGBTQ and disability in the same hashtag ever on a national level. So that really means a lot to me. One of the things I think we need to talk about, though, is physical accessibility in the LGBT community. I came from Los Angeles, where things in the LGBT community were fairly accessible. And I came to the East Coast, I went to New York, and I came to Washington, and then everybody was like, oh, that's just the East Coast. Deal with the inaccessibility, deal with the fact that you can't get in the building. We can't work together if people can't get in the damn building to work with those individuals. And I can't, I don't want to live in a society where my friends have to lift me in and out of a building just to spend time with them. That is something that we need to address, and I hope people of the LGBTQ community are here and hearing me. We need physical access into your buildings, and you guys need to be at the forefront of this, please. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to walk over here really quick. There's a hand in the back. I was just going to give props to NCTE for a second because I walked into your office one day shortly before your move, and on the big whiteboard, Mara Kiesling, your executive director, had laid out all the pluses and minuses about your now new location, but at that point, yet to be new location. And she said to me, she's like, Becca, by the way, we're marking off 2 and 3 automatically. And I said, well, why, Mara? And Mara's response was, they're not accessible. Why would we be in a place where people can't get to us? So I think the awareness is coming. And at the same time, I will say to my colleagues in the disability community, we have to be equally as accessible and inclusive of our LGBT folks, because I know I'm really tired of hearing some of the folks in the older generations and some of the folks in the younger generation not being as inclusive as I know we need to be. This is Rebecca Coakley. The Executive Director of the National Council on Disability. The Executive Director of the National Council on Disability. Thank you for reminding me, Maria Town. I'm Maria's microphone accommodation.
Hello, I'm Richard Davis. I'm a gay bipolar survivor of domestic violence, and I wanted to ask the panel as community leaders, some of the things you brought up with your own lived experiences came to mind. And when I'm thinking about what maybe heterosexual, cisgender, able-bodied people, when they need resources and things like that, they know where to go. But for our community, how are you addressing things like just for ideas too about ableism, heteronormativity, cisnormativity? Because, for example, when I was going through my social work program in Houston, we worked with an LGBT youth group, and they, as we saw the statistics, LGBT youth are disproportionately homeless, fleeing domestic violence, and the intersectionality of that with things like autism, where it's not unheard of to say, well, why don't we put tracking devices on people who, when someone's running away from home, there's usually a reason for that. And it wasn't too long ago that LGBT was also considered a disorder that, when sorry, one of the things that's coming to mind about that, though, is in a lot of conservative communities, it's usually faith-based organizations, and to their credit, doing a lot of great work. But when someone who is transgender comes in and they're asked, well, hey, we split by gender, what's your biological sex, and that's the identity they're stuck with, they're not affirming that. And so as a community talking about LGBTQ and disability issues and things, there are so many things that come to mind with youth who are running away from home, and ageism and how that factors in, and whether or not they're taken seriously. And when they come to a place that doesn't affirm them, what gets blamed? Oh, well, it's because you're gay. Oh, well, it's because you're transgender. Oh, well, it must be because of the autism and things like that. Also, same-sex couples, there are women's centers, but the assumption with heteronormativity is, oh, well, women are fleeing, domestic violence with men. What about lesbian couples? With men, one of the things that was really hard for me to see was police showing up for two gay men having a dispute and being laughed at. Oh, well, this is a joke. This is so funny. So with your role as community leaders, some of you talked about personal experiences and things. I'm just curious if anyone on the panel can talk about what are some effective ways that we've addressed things like ableism, heteronormativity, and things like that, and what are some ways that you might advise that we, as the folks in this room, can start to also address those issues as well. Thank you.
I'm gonna take the moderator privilege real quick and talk as a fellow queer bipolar person, and by the way, you feel free to grab me later for my card. I want to just say that one of the biggest issues affecting is within the disability community itself, of a very, I sometimes think of it as hierarchical ableism, where it will be of, hey, you have it sucks, but at least you're not crazy, or oh, at least we're not like those people, or I take an antipsychotic, but it's for depression. Don't worry, for example. And like a few days ago, I actually had someone tell me, because I was complaining about, taking 10 pills a day, and I like to gross people out by taking them all at once in front of them. Yeah. And what they said was, well, at least you can walk. And my reaction is like, it's 10 p.m. I really didn't need this now to have to explain to you why is that so horrible that you just said. But yeah, a lot of that falls on the doorstep of the disability community itself. If others want to take.
I do think that there is a lot of internal strife but within communities. For example, disability communities where anti-LGBT rhetoric is allowed, or people that serve disabled people and are constantly hostile toward us, or on the other hand, queer spaces that are ableist. And I do think that faith-based spaces and being in more conservative communities can present a challenge. To go back to a personal story, I actually ran away from my family household when I was about 20, and I was living in Texas, very, very conservative. I did not have access to services that would have helped me, so I ran away to San Francisco. Yeah, Victoria knows the story. But people should not have to go that far away just to get the services they need. I think there needs to be some way to try to communicate with organizations that might be more receptive to accept people for their sexual orientation or gender identity or romantic orientation or whatever it may be for that person. I also think that it's probably a good idea to start organizations that can fill those gaps that those current conservative organizations can't, because there's such a crisis, because there are so many of us who have had to flee their homes or have been kicked out of their homes or have been deprived, membership in their community just because of who we happen to be or who we happen to love or whatever our abilities or disabilities may be. And that is absolutely crucial. Thank you for bringing that up.
One thing I want to really quickly mention about that is this: I want to dispel this idea that there are places where services are accessible to everyone. Because I'm in Chicago and we have laws protecting access, for instance, access to shelters for trans women, and yet I still have trans women on my couch because they're getting kicked out of these shelters. And so all it takes is one bigot in that entire organization to disenfranchise someone, and particularly trans women are having a very difficult time accessing any services anywhere. And it's because there is a very particular brand of trans misogyny that is causing this, and it's really a problem. Like, it's I don't have an answer for you on that. It's like we need to knock down doors. We need to, we need to make some noise on this.
I was going to say, just wanted to add that I think that there is both this role of disruption and then there is this role of education, right? And I don't think it is the marginalized person's responsibility to educate, but it is allies' responsibility to educate. And if you are an ally of a community, your job is to help someone who doesn't get it, and not from a place of what I call sort of egoistic morality, right? Like, I'm so much better and smarter than you because I understand, and so now I need to perform allyship by telling you how you ain't right because you don't get it. But what does it look like to have a conversation with people until they actually have a breakthrough? One of the most powerful stories that I have is the first time that I took a coworker of mine, a trans woman, home with me to visit my mother, who had never met a trans person before in her life. And if you listen to her rhetoric around trans identity, she would have been a bigot. Without question, that's exactly what she sounded like. And when we left that visit, she was like, oh, that's my daughter. That's my other daughter. And there wasn't a question about pronouns. There wasn't a question about who this woman was. She was absolutely unapologetically accepted because someone had to be the bridge. And it was my job as an ally to be the bridge. And we need to be looking for the places where we can be the bridge.
I don't know how much time we have. Okay, 2 more questions. And I know all of us are people who love the sound of our own voices. I am one of those. So let's keep it concise so that others can also talk.
Okay, sure. My name is Angel Hernandez. I'm the facilitator of LGBT 50+ initiative with the AARP in Puerto Rico. And also, I'm with Positively Healthy Initiative. And also, we are part of the scientific committee within the ACTG network doing HIV and AIDS research to things. I like what people are saying about developing leadership from the grassroots, because we are privileged to be here. We were having this discussion if an American man or a gay Latino man will be here representing the HIV clinical research community, and we decided together that will be me and Monique. And also, we understand that that leadership, our privilege, have to focus on the people, on the street, on the communities, because I'm a believer on that, just to develop leadership within those people who don't have the privilege to be here with us. Also, I think was the lady next to you, Victoria, who mentioned the elders. I appreciate that. And the last person on the table who mentioned about just being persons, not talking about our intersectionalities, just being persons. And those are the issues that we need to rise. Also, concerning research, we need more transgender people to get involved within the HIV and AIDS research. We have a lot of people from the transgender populations, and we need more of you together with us. Thank you.
Before I pass on the question, I'd just like to remind, if you're referring to Saray, they use they pronouns, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you.
Not mistaken.
So, if anyone wants to talk,
Hi, I think I'm supposed to introduce myself. So I'm Julia Bascom. I'm the Deputy Executive Director for the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. A bunch of people have said a bunch of things I wanted to ask about. I really appreciate the focus here on talking about healthcare. I don't know how you can get more direct about violence than talking about the consequences of inadequate healthcare and healthcare that's been denied. In this limited time, I wanted to ask a question about special education specifically. I know that certainly the things I've observed are not unique, but I frequently see students who have behavior plans emphasizing gender conformity. It's really common in some of the therapies that autistic kids go through, especially when we're young, to be taught to sort things and to sort boy from girl, and you can tell it's the boy because he has the short hair and so on and so forth. I don't really see the LGBT community being involved in a lot of these conversations about special education and about students in special education, especially students with significant intellectual disabilities and communication disabilities. And I'd just really like to hear if you have thoughts about how we can go about changing that.
That's such a great question. As a young person, I was put in anger management instead of any kind of thing like that. So, which is, I'm pretty sure, very common for poor Black people who are autistic, right? So it's like, actually, you know, like whatever's going on for you in classrooms with you being overwhelmed, that's not the problem. The problem is that you keep on having these meltdowns and you scare the other students and you might bite someone. And I know that that is definitely like framing that comes from parents. And I think that it reifies the fact that we don't listen to people with intellectual disabilities and assume that people who are autistic and also have intellectual disabilities, who are the most discriminated against kind of autistic people, right? Like there's no question. Those are the people, those are autistic people who are being killed in the streets, you know? Even though autistic people who don't have intellectual disabilities have other problems, specifically with suicide, we know that it is autistic people with intellectual disabilities who are experiencing the kind of denials of care, especially transition-related care and LGBT care. I wonder, though, you know, someone brought up before about like thinking about ableism in the LGBT community. LGBT communities are just ableist. Like they are absolutely to the point where like even diseases that are coded as LGBT may not consider themselves disabled, you know? Like it's something for someone else because there's something abject and disgusting to people, you know, about being disabled, particularly something that is visible and written on the body. And so I don't know what we have to do necessarily to re-educate LGBT people. I think it's really making sure that people know that they are disabled, right? So if you are taking medication every day for whatever you're taking medication for every day and you can't live without it, you are a disabled person, right? Like there are so many people out here who are descriptively disabled, who are not politically disabled, and that has to change.
I wanted to follow up on Julia's question, which is a really great question. So I wanted to highlight this need for work in particular around affirming autistic people, especially autistic people with communication difficulties and intellectual disabilities, affirming their abilities to assert their gender, to recognize their own gender. So I think a lot of times in special ed settings and also in a lot of therapy settings, there are therapists and educators and professionals who are not only saying to autistic kids, no, you do not have the capacity to recognize your own gender, or you're doing gender wrong, or you just don't understand, and that's why you think you're trans or gender nonconforming. There are also people who are actively trying to suppress behaviors that they see as gender nonconforming as part of this effort to make autistic people act less autistic. So if someone is behaving in a way that's more masculine or feminine than an educator or a therapist or whatever thinks is appropriate for their gender or their sex assigned at birth, then often they're subjected to normalizing therapies, quote unquote normalizing, that force them or try to coerce them into conforming to the stereotypes associated with the sex they were assigned at birth. And I think that's a huge, huge problem, and we need a lot more work around that.
Maria's telling me that I'm supposed to say that ASAN recently with NCTE and the task force put out a statement affirming the rights of autistic people to receive gender confirming, affirming services in healthcare. It's a start. I think we have a lot more to do, but I'm really glad we're doing it with you. And thank you for reminding me to say that.
And if I could also say, part of the statement, as part of the statement, we are launching a social media campaign to amplify the voices of trans autistic people and their allies. We are encouraging people to use the hashtag Autistic Trans Pride to share their stories about being autistic and trans, or supporting people who are autistic and trans.
I will mention that I am really proud of the effort that went into that statement, especially as it took us probably a solid 6 months to write it out between the three of us. So, yeah. With that, I want. Oh, awesome.
Sorry. My name is Shane Newmeyer. I'm an autistic person and non-binary. I feel like I've gotten some good lead up to this between Richard and Julia and many of the panelists here. But one of the things that's been alluded to is that a common theme is that disabled and or LGBTQ youth in particular, because of their status as legal minors, are particularly vulnerable to coercion and other forms of oppression. One thing that is kind of related to Julia's point is that there's a linked history between conversion therapy, forced normalization of gender and sexuality expression, and behavioral therapy, quote unquote, for autistic people. And while conversion therapy has gone out of vogue in the mainstream U.S., the gold standard for autistic people's treatment is still the same kind of thing. The same researchers developed both. And similarly, while people will defend the rights of parents to sterilize their disabled child, to make them easier to carry around so they won't become pregnant if they are raped, on the other hand, kids with kids who are LGBTQ identified, trans especially, you get an uproar if you suggest that they, without their parents' consent, should be able to choose transition care at the age that they recognize that, yes, I am not the gender that other people have assigned me at birth. So a problem is not just the particular rights or the particular problems, but also the idea of presuming incompetence and making people the essential quasi-property of their parents or guardians to begin with, whether they're adult people with disabilities or children of any kind.
In short, do you promise?
I was just wondering, because, I'm Karen Hitzelberger, and I work at United Cerebral Palsy, but I was just wondering, because this wasn't something that we talked about a lot, how do we make sure that people with physical disabilities who require care to take care of their basic needs, like taking a shower or getting out of bed, have the right to express their unique sexualities without fearing having those basic care needs not being met because the people caring for them don't agree with the sexuality that they express?
Maybe we can go to people in the audience, or like if anyone.
I guess that what keeps coming up for me in a lot of these questions is, one, there's a piece of information that's about, like, what are we requiring of service providers, right? And so the idea that you can get a job as a caretaker and then still enact your own personal opinion on someone's body, to me sounds like an entire issue that we need to be talking about, the protections of, or the training and education and sort of standard of care that we're providing folks. And I also feel like that's the same, that we're just, I feel like there's this sort of like, as we talk about the experiences of marginalized communities, all of a sudden the way that people's individual opinions are allowed to just be present, which doesn't exist in any other jobs in the country. And so I don't understand. I can't go to McDonald's and decide I work at McDonald's and just tell them how I feel about shit. I'm sorry. So I'm just confused. So I'm not understanding why. I think that there needs to be a loud and vocal presence that says that if you are holding prejudiced, biased, bigoted, oppressive views, sorry, you can't be employed here. And that we need to make that a standard in terms of the care that we're providing. And I'm not seeing a mass sort of rallying around that. And I really would like to see that being raised.
So I know that there are a lot more people with questions. We are out of time at this point, probably even over that. But at least as far as I'm concerned, and I also encourage that to everyone here who has the spoon still to do that. You can grab us and ask us questions. And as far as I'm concerned, I keep very much an open inbox policy. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for coming. And I was going to ask for a round of applause, but we already got that done.